They climbed at 4,000 feet per minute, Mitsubishi engines roaring at full power, watching the American fighters slip away beneath them. The Zero pilots pulled back on their control sticks with practiced ease, each feeling the familiar harmony between pilot and machine. The aircraft responded like something alive, light, eager, obedient. It was the morning of August 7, 1943, high above Vella La Vella in the Solomon Islands. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai led his section through rising towers of cumulus cloud, wrapped in the confidence that came from mastering the most maneuverable fighter aircraft in the world. Whatever the Americans were flying down there, they couldn't follow. They never could. The Zero could outturn anything the Americans or the British put in the air. It could outclimb them too. At altitudes where enemy fighters staggered and struggled, the Zero stayed sharp, responsive, deadly. Sakai had proved this again and again, over China, over the Philippines, over New Guinea. With 300 combat hours in Zeros, he knew exactly what his aircraft could do. But something felt different this morning. Far above, almost invisible against the deep tropical blue sky, thin contrails drew sharp geometric lines. Aircraft flying at heights the Zero rarely reached, heights where the air turned thin and bitingly cold. Sakai narrowed his eyes, trying to make out their shapes. Then the contrails shifted, turned, and began to fall. They came down in steep, nearly vertical dives, descending faster than anything Sakai had seen. They weren't trying to turn with the Zeros, they weren't even thinking about a dogfight, they were doing something completely different. What Sakai witnessed that morning marked the beginning of the end of the Zero's reign over the Pacific. The aircraft streaking down from above were Lockheed P-38 Lightnings, twin-engine, twin-boom fighters built on a totally different philosophy of air combat. They weren't there to circle and duel. They were using altitude, speed, and brute power. Attack from above, hit hard, then climb away before anyone could react. The Americans called it boom and zoom. The Zero couldn't chase them up. It couldn't catch them in a dive. And it couldn't survive the blast of firepower when the P-38s came screaming down from 30,000 feet. The question at the center of this story is simple but striking. How did an aircraft that ruled Pacific air combat for 2 full years, that crushed everything in its path during the war's early campaigns, suddenly become obsolete? Not because the Zero changed, but because the nature of the fight changed around it. The Zero's greatest strengths, its unmatched maneuverability and blistering climb rate, stopped mattering the moment American pilots refused to fight on Japan's terms. This is the story of how Japanese naval aviators, the most skilled and experienced fighter pilots in the world in 1941, discovered that their seemingly perfect weapon carried fatal weaknesses they had never imagined. It's a story about design philosophy, tactical evolution, and the moment when confidence built on real victories collided with an enemy who refused to fight the expected battle. The Mitsubishi A6M0 did not appear by chance. It was the result of strict engineering requirements issued by the Imperial Japanese Navy in 1937. They demanded a carrier-based fighter capable of escorting bombers on long-range missions over China, defending the fleet from enemy aircraft, and winning air superiority battles. These goals clashed with one another. Long range required efficiency and extremely low weight. Air superiority demanded agility and fast climb. Carrier duty required toughness and reliability. Most aviation experts believed no single aircraft could do all of these things. Jiro Horikoshi, chief designer at Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, chose to prioritize range and maneuverability above everything else. Every component was built with weight savings in mind. The airframe used a new aluminum alloy created specifically for aircraft construction, stronger than standard aluminum, yet still light enough to hit the required targets. Horikoshi removed armor plating for the pilot. He removed self-sealing fuel tanks, the rubber-lined tanks that protected aircraft from bursting into flames when hit. He used fabric instead of metal on the ailerons and control surfaces. He built the smallest cockpit possible, just big enough for the pilot and his instruments. The result was an astonishingly light aircraft. It weighed only 3,074 pounds empty and 5,813 pounds when fully loaded with fuel and ammunition, about half the weight of American fighters being developed at the same time. That weight difference produced extraordinary performance. The Zero could climb to 19,000 feet in 7.5 minutes. At sea level, its maximum climb rate was 4,000 feet per minute. It could turn tighter than any fighter of its era, completing a full 360-degree turn in under 16 seconds. Its range was unmatched. With drop tanks, the Zero could fly nearly 2,000 miles, far beyond anything any other fighter could accomplish. Its armament suited its time: two 7.7mm machine guns mounted in the nose, firing through the propeller arc, and two 20mm cannons, one buried in each wing, for devastating strikes against bombers and ground targets. The 20mm Type 99 cannon was a licensed copy of the Swiss Oerlikon design, firing explosive shells at 600 rounds per minute. With just 60 rounds per gun, a pilot had enough ammunition for only a few attack passes before needing to return to base or carrier. Japanese naval aviators who first flew the Zero in 1940 knew instantly that they had been handed something extraordinary. The aircraft answered the slightest touch on the controls, responding almost as if it could sense the pilot's intentions. In mock combat against older Japanese fighters, the Zero was untouchable. Pilots were stunned by its climb rate, its razor-sharp turning ability, and its unbelievable range. When the first Zeros arrived in China in mid-1940, they delivered immediate and overwhelming success. Chinese pilots flying Soviet-built Polikarpov F-15 and I-16 fighters found themselves outclassed in every category, except perhaps straight-line speed at low altitude. The Zero could climb over them, dive on them, and break away before they had any chance to respond. By December 1941, when Japan launched its offensive across the Pacific, Zero pilots had already gained hundreds of hours of real combat experience over China. They had developed tactics tailored to their aircraft's strengths. Their doctrine emphasized turning combat and smart energy management using vertical maneuvers. A Zero pilot began an engagement by climbing to a higher position, diving to build speed, firing in a quick pass, then using that speed to climb back up to altitude. If the enemy tried to turn with him, the Zero simply turned tighter and slipped onto his tail. If the enemy tried to dive away, the Zero followed, and with its superior climb rate, easily regained altitude afterward. These tactics worked flawlessly against the opponents Japan encountered in the early months of the war. At Pearl Harbor, the few American fighters that managed to take off, Curtiss P-36 Hawks and P-40 Warhawks, weren't built for the type of combat where the Zero excelled. Over the Philippines, American P-40s and P-35s were destroyed in huge numbers, many caught on the ground and others overwhelmed in the air by superior Japanese tactics and coordination. Over Malaya and Singapore, British Brewster Buffaloes and Hawker Hurricanes proved completely outmatched. The Buffalo, a stubby, underpowered fighter originally designed for carrier use but rejected by the U.S. Navy, was slower than the Zero, handled worse, and carried limited armament. The Hurricane, though effective in European combat, was designed for a different environment. It was tough and could take hits, but it couldn't match the Zero's climb rate or turning ability at the altitudes where Pacific air battles unfolded. British and Commonwealth pilots found themselves flying aircraft built to fend off German bombers over Europe, not to dogfight highly maneuverable Japanese fighters at 20,000 feet above humid tropical jungles. The results were predictable and devastating. In the first 4 months of the Pacific War, Zero pilots achieved kill ratios that seemed almost unreal. Reports claimed 10, 12, even 15 enemy aircraft shot down for every Zero lost. These figures were inflated by the chaos of combat. Multiple pilots often fired at the same target, and adrenaline pushed men to overestimate their success. But even after discounting exaggeration, the real numbers still landed around 6 or 7 to 1 in Japan's favor. That level of superiority was real, measurable, and crushing to Allied air forces. Zero pilots understood they were flying the finest fighter in the Pacific, and their exhaustive training only reinforced that confidence. Japanese naval aviator training was among the toughest on Earth, requiring years of preparation before a pilot was considered ready for combat. Trainees spent months mastering formation flying, navigation, gunnery, and aerobatics. They practiced until their reactions became instinctive, until flying felt like second nature. The men flying Zeros in the early months of the Pacific War came from a selection and training system unmatched in Western air forces. Before the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy accepted only the top 10% of applicants, rejecting 90% outright during entrance exams. Those who passed entered 3 years of relentless preparation. At the Yokosuka Naval Air Corps, the Navy's main training center, students endured physical conditioning that often bordered on outright brutality. They ran 10 kilometers before breakfast. They trained for hours in judo and kendo. They swam in cold water to harden their bodies and strengthen their will. Flight training demanded absolute discipline. Students learned to fly in tight, precise formations, wingtip to wingtip through clouds and foul weather. They practiced combat maneuvers until muscle memory guided every motion. Gunnery training used live ammunition against towed targets, and students had to meet strict accuracy standards to advance. Navigation training was just as unforgiving. Trainees learned to fly long over water missions where a single degree of error could mean getting lost at sea and dying when the fuel ran dry. By the time a naval aviator earned his wings and joined a frontline unit, he typically accumulated between 300 and 800 flight hours, far more than his American or British counterparts. The Zero pilots who struck Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Malaya were not simply well trained, they were seasoned combat veterans. Many had been fighting over China for years. Flight Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, who would become one of Japan's top aces with 64 confirmed victories, had already been flying combat missions since 1938. Warrant Officer Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who may have been Japan's highest-scoring ace with more than 80 victories, had sharpened his skills through hundreds of hours of combat flying. These men understood their aircraft completely. They knew exactly how much speed they could trade for altitude, how tight they could turn before stalling, how to manage engine temperature and fuel consumption during long engagements. Despite its light construction, the Zero was not fragile during normal flight operations. The airframe could withstand 6.5 G positive and 3.5 G negative before structural failure. Adequate limits for the smooth, sweeping maneuvers Japanese pilots preferred. The Sakai engine, a 14-cylinder radial producing 940 horsepower at takeoff, was reliable and fuel efficient. It could run for hours at cruise power, burning fuel slowly enough to give the Zero its remarkable range. The cockpit, though cramped by Western standards, was sensibly laid out. The control stick sat naturally in the pilot's hand. The throttle quadrant was positioned for quick, easy access. The gun sight, a simple optical unit with an illuminated reticle, functioned well in the clear Pacific air. But what the Zero did not have was protection. There was no armor plate behind the pilot, no armored glass in the windscreen. The fuel tanks, holding more than 200 gallons, had no self-sealing lining. One tracer round striking a tank could ignite the fuel, turning the aircraft into a fireball within seconds. The lightweight aluminum frame, while strong enough for normal flying, crumpled under heavy gunfire. A burst of 50 caliber rounds could shear off a wing or tail. Japanese designers had accepted these vulnerabilities deliberately. They traded protection for performance, believing the aircraft would face opponents with limited firepower and shorter range. It was a logical choice in their early combat environment. Chinese fighters carried rifle-caliber guns that rarely caused catastrophic damage, even when they hit. Soviet aircraft encountered at Nomonhan in 1939 carried heavier armament but couldn't stay with the Zero in sustained maneuvering combat. Meanwhile, the Americans were learning, slowly but steadily. After the disasters of December 1941 and the desperate defensive battles through mid-1942, U.S. Navy and Marine Corps squadrons began analyzing Zero tactics and searching for counters. The investigation started with recovered documents and damaged aircraft. Then came a breakthrough. In July 1942, American forces recovered a nearly intact Zero that had crashed in the Aleutian Islands. The pilot, Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, had died in the crash, but his aircraft was repairable. Engineers transported it to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, where it was painstakingly restored to flying condition. Test pilots flew the captured Zero repeatedly, measuring every performance trait and mapping out every flaw. These flights confirmed what many combat reports had hinted at. The Zero could outturn any American fighter. Its climb rate was exceptional, but it also had weaknesses that could be exploited. Above 200 mph indicated airspeed, the Zero's ailerons grew heavy, demanding significant physical force to roll the aircraft. In high-speed dives, the Zero's controls stiffened so drastically that quick maneuvers became nearly impossible. Its light wing loading, an advantage in low-speed dogfights, turned into a dangerous liability at high speeds. American fighters, built heavier and stronger, could dive faster and remain controllable at speeds that made the Zero unstable and even hazardous to fly. The Navy passed this information to frontline squadrons along with clear tactical instructions. Do not dogfight a Zero. Do not try to outturn it. Use speed and altitude. Make fast, slashing attacks from above. Fire a burst. Then break away before the Zero can react. Rely on superior diving speed and high-speed handling. And above all, never get slow in a fight. These tactics, refined in battle, became standard procedure by mid-1943. But good tactics alone weren't enough. They required aircraft capable of executing them. The F-4F Wildcat, the Navy's main carrier fighter through 1942, could only partially implement these strategies. It was tough and armed with 650 caliber machine guns, carrying plenty of ammunition, but it was slow, barely reaching 320 mph in level flight, and had an unimpressive climb rate. What the Navy needed was a fighter that could climb fast, fight at high altitudes, dive at extreme speeds, and deliver crushing firepower. The Army Air Forces already had such an aircraft. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, designed in 1937 to meet Army specifications for a high-altitude interceptor, was unlike anything else in the sky. Lockheed's engineering team, led by Hall Hibbard and Clarence Kelly Johnson, created a fighter that broke every convention of aircraft design. The P-38 used two engines, twin Allison V-1710s, each producing 175 horsepower. These engines were mounted in long twin booms extending back from the wings, while the pilot and all weaponry sat in a central nacelle. This unique layout gave the aircraft remarkable performance at high altitude. The turbo-supercharged engines maintained full power up to 25,000 feet and beyond, heights where most other fighters struggled for oxygen and lost efficiency. At 30,000 feet, the P-38 could cruise at over 300 mph and still climb at more than 2,000 feet per minute. In a dive, it could reach nearly 500 mph, far beyond anything a Japanese fighter could match. Its armament was deadly: 450 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, all mounted tightly together in the nose. Their fire converged naturally at any range, delivering a focused, devastating stream of bullets with no alignment issues. A 2-second burst delivered roughly 150 rounds, more than enough to destroy any aircraft it struck. The P-38 began arriving in the South Pacific in late 1942. The first units equipped with Lightnings were Army Air Forces fighter groups operating from Guadalcanal and New Guinea. Pilots transitioning from P-39 Airacobras and P-40 Warhawks initially found the P-38 challenging. It was faster, more complex, and demanded a different flying technique. But once pilots learned to exploit its strengths, the Lightning transformed air combat in the Pacific. The key was altitude. P-38 pilots routinely climbed to 25,000 or even 30,000 feet before entering enemy-controlled areas, often spending half an hour gaining altitude while still over friendly territory. From that height, they could see nearly 100 miles on clear days, scanning for Japanese formations below. When they found a target, the attack began with a maneuver no Japanese fighter could match: the Lightning's high-speed power dive. These were not shallow dive-and-zoom attacks that Zeros could intercept, but near-vertical plunges at full throttle, accelerating to speeds Japanese pilots had never encountered. The tactic was brutally efficient: identify the target, roll inverted, pull into a steep dive, build speed to 450-500 mph, fire a short, concentrated burst at close range, and continue straight through the dive. Using the momentum, the pilot would then climb back to altitude, far above the performance envelope of the Zero. The rules were simple: never turn with a Zero, never slow down, and never fight on its terms. Japanese pilots first experienced this new threat over New Guinea in early 1943. The shock was immediate and profound. Zeros patrolling at 15,000 or 20,000 feet suddenly came under fire from above, often without warning. By the time they realized they were under attack, the P-38s were already past them, diving away at speeds the Zero could not approach. Pilots who tried to pursue found their Zeros shaking violently in the airflow. The controls stiffened to the point of near immobility. Those who attempted to climb instead discovered that the P-38s were already rising back toward the upper atmosphere, climbing faster than they could hope to match. One Japanese pilot interviewed after the war described his first encounter with P-38s over Bougainville in July 1943. His four-plane section of Zeros was escorting bombers toward Guadalcanal when tracers suddenly slashed through the formation. He instinctively broke left, pulling hard into a tight turn. The Zero responded flawlessly, but there was nothing to fight. The lightnings that had attacked were already distant specks, climbing back toward the sun. His wingman did not make it. The pilot never saw the attack that killed him, only the empty sky where his wingman had been seconds earlier. The survivor tried to climb to engage, pulling his Zero into a maximum rate ascent. At 22,000 feet, the aircraft was still responsive, but noticeably slower. By 25,000 feet, the controls felt sluggish. At 28,000 feet, he was barely holding altitude. Above him, the P-38 circled at 35,000 feet like hawks, untouchable. The tactical revelation unfolded gradually, then all at once. Through the summer and fall of 1943, Japanese fighter units across the Pacific encountered the same frustrating pattern. American fighters, primarily P-38s, along with the newer F-6F Hellcats from Navy carriers, refused to engage in traditional turning combat. They attacked from above in fast slashing passes, used their speed to escape, and climbed back to safety before Japanese pilots could respond. Every advantage the Zero had relied upon, every capability that had made it dominant for 2 years, became irrelevant when the enemy simply would not fight on Japanese terms. Zero pilots experimented with counter-tactics. Some attempted to climb to extreme altitudes before combat, hoping to meet the Americans on equal footing. But climbing to 30,000 feet consumed massive amounts of fuel and time, leaving pilots with very little combat endurance. The Zero's engine, unlike American turbo-supercharged engines, lost power steadily above 20,000 feet. By 30,000 feet, the aircraft was barely controllable, wallowing in the thin air with minimal excess power. Other pilots tried the classic defensive circle, aircraft flying in continuous turns to cover each other's tails. Against a dogfighting opponent, this tactic was almost unbeatable. Against P-38s diving at 500 mph, firing, and continuing straight through without turning, the defensive circle only made them easier targets. Americans could attack any plane in the formation from above and be gone before the circle could react. Some experienced pilots attempted to bait P-38s into turning combat by appearing damaged or unaware. Occasionally this worked if American pilots became overconfident. But disciplined Lightning pilots ignored these apparent opportunities, maintaining altitude advantage and waiting for real chances to strike. The problem was not Japanese tactics, it was physics and design philosophy. The Zero had been engineered for a specific type of combat against specific opponents. When the environment changed, the aircraft could not adapt. Japanese engineers recognized this limitation. Mitsubishi began developing improved versions of the Zero with more powerful engines, enhanced armor protection, and heavier armament. The A6M5, introduced in late 1943, featured a more powerful Sakai engine, producing 1,130 horsepower, improved exhaust stacks that increased speed, and strengthened wing structures for higher diving velocities. But these improvements came at a cost. The added weight reduced the climb rate and turning ability that had once been the Zero's defining advantages. The new model was faster in level flight and could dive more safely, but it no longer outturned American fighters as dramatically. Objectively, it was a superior aircraft in many respects, yet it had lost the defining characteristics that had made the original Zero extraordinary. More advanced designs reached the prototype stage but never entered large-scale production. The A7M Repu, intended to replace the Zero, featured a 2,000 horsepower engine, much heavier armor, and performance on par with the best American fighters. Only 9 were completed before the war ended. Japan's industrial capacity, already strained by years of conflict and increasingly disrupted by American submarine attacks on shipping and B-29 bombing raids on factories, could not produce these advanced aircraft in meaningful numbers while simultaneously building ships, submarines, and the thousands of aircraft required for kamikaze operations. The Zero remained Japan's primary fighter through 1945, not because it was adequate, but because nothing else was available in sufficient quantity. For Japanese naval aviators, the psychological impact of the Zero's obsolescence was profound. These were men who had trained for years, gained extensive combat experience while their enemies were still learning basic skills, and had dominated the Pacific skies with an aircraft they trusted completely. Discovering that their trusted weapon was no longer sufficient and being sent into combat against superior opponents shattered morale in ways that strategic defeats alone could not. Saburo Sakai, the veteran pilot who survived the war with 64 confirmed victories, reflected on this transition in his post-war memoir. In 1941 and 1942, he wrote, "Japanese pilots flew with absolute confidence. They knew their aircraft was superior. They knew their training was better. They trusted their tactics." By late 1943, that confidence had vanished. Pilots climbed into their Zeros aware they were at a disadvantage, knowing that American pilots could choose when and how to fight, and that survival often depended more on luck and enemy mistakes than on their own skill. The casualty rates confirmed this reality. In the war's first 6 months, Japanese naval aviation lost roughly 180 pilots killed or missing in combat. These losses had been sustainable when replacements were well trained, but the training pipeline was already eroding. The elite 3-year training program that had produced Japan's finest pilots in 1941 required resources and time that no longer existed. Training was progressively shortened to 18 months, then 12, then 6. New pilots arrived at frontline units with barely 200 hours of flight time, less than a third of what their predecessors had accumulated. They flew increasingly obsolete aircraft against opponents with superior equipment, greater numbers, and steadily improving training. In 1943, Japanese naval aviation lost roughly 900 pilots. In 1944, losses exceeded 2,000. By 1945, the figures became almost meaningless as the kamikaze campaign consumed pilots and aircraft in deliberate suicide missions. The Zero, originally designed as an air superiority fighter, ended the war carrying bombs on one-way attacks against American ships. Meanwhile, American pilots refined their tactics and grew more confident. P-38 units developed standardized combat formations optimized for boom and zoom attacks. 4-plane flights operated in staggered formations at different altitudes, providing mutual support while maintaining an energy advantage. When Japanese fighters appeared below, the highest flight dove first, attacked, and climbed away. If Zeros attempted to follow, the second flight struck from a different angle. Japanese pilots were forced to choose, ignore the first attack and accept casualties, or respond and expose themselves to the follow-up strike. Either way, they suffered losses without inflicting comparable damage. The kill ratios reversed. By mid-1944, American fighters were achieving 3 or 4 kills for every loss, sometimes better. Japanese pilots who had once claimed 10 victories for every loss now found themselves lucky to survive a few missions. The industrial disparity underlying these outcomes became impossible to ignore. American factories produced over 18,000 P-38s during the war. Grumman built more than 12,000 F-6F Hellcats, the carrier fighter that replaced the Wildcat, which proved equally capable of energy tactics against Zeros. These were produced alongside thousands of other fighters, bombers, transports, and training aircraft. Japan produced a total of 10,149 Zeros from 1940 through 1945, representing a significant portion of its entire fighter production. The Americans could absorb losses in training accidents, combat, and attrition, replacing aircraft and pilots faster than they were lost. Japan could not. Every Zero lost was irreplaceable. Every experienced pilot killed left a gap that could not be filled with an equally trained replacement. The story of the Zero's obsolescence is not simply about one aircraft being surpassed by better designs. It is about what happens when tactical excellence and design optimized for specific conditions meets an opponent who refuses to fight the expected battle. The Zero was genuinely exceptional at what it was designed to do, in turning combat at medium altitude against lightly armed opponents. It had no equal in the early years of the war. Japanese pilots who flew it were among the most skilled aviators in any air force. But exceptional skill and optimized equipment cannot overcome fundamental strategic disadvantages when the enemy adapts faster than you can respond. The Americans learned from their defeats. They analyzed captured equipment, tested theories, and developed tactics that exploited enemy weaknesses while avoiding enemy strengths. They produced aircraft in quantities that allowed them to lose battles while learning, confident they could replace losses and return stronger. They built training systems that produced adequate pilots quickly, accepting lower individual skill but compensating with numbers and superior equipment. Japan could not match this approach. Limited industrial capacity prevented mass production of advanced aircraft. Limited training resources prevented rapid replacement of experienced pilots. Strategic bombing and submarine warfare progressively destroyed the industrial base and cut off access to raw materials. By 1944, Japan was fighting with weapons designed in the 1930s against opponents using aircraft specifically developed to counter them. The morning flight petty officer Sakai watched P-38s diving from 30,000 feet above Lilla was the moment when old certainties died. The Zero could still outturn American fighters. It could still climb impressively at low altitude, but these capabilities no longer mattered. The Americans had changed the nature of air combat, relying on altitude and speed instead of turning ability, overwhelming firepower instead of maneuverability, and systematic tactical doctrine instead of individual virtuosity. Sakai survived the war, one of the few Japanese aces to do so. In post-war interviews, he reflected on the transition with remarkable clarity. The Zero, he said, was the perfect weapon for the war Japan expected to fight. But America refused to fight that war. They fought on their own terms, using their strengths against Japanese weaknesses. No amount of courage or skill could overcome that fundamental reality. The Zero continued flying through August 1945, until Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast ended hostilities. By then, the aircraft was obsolete by half a decade of development, flown by pilots with minimal training against enemies with every possible advantage. It remained a symbol of Japanese naval aviation, but a symbol of what had been lost rather than what might have been achieved. The lesson transcends the specific aircraft and conflict. In war, as in any competition between complex systems, optimization for one set of conditions creates vulnerability when conditions change. The side that adapts faster, able to learn, adjust, and rebuild, holds the advantage regardless of initial tactical success. The Zero pilots who climbed confidently toward American aircraft that morning above La Vela, believing their superiority was assured, learned this truth in the most direct way possible. They remained among the world's best fighter pilots, but they were flying yesterday's aircraft into tomorrow's battle. The outcome was never in doubt once the pilots realized that Americans had stopped fighting on Japanese terms and were fighting on their own. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now.